Hello, my name is Tatiana DiMascio, and I'm the Senior Technical Lead at the National Geospatial Technical Operations Center, USGS. And I'll be talking to you about the Nationwide Trails Network. I'll give you a status update and future plans for the Nationwide Trails Network. Elizabeth McCartney, she's the project manager for she works for the National Geospatial Program at USGS, and she will also be available for questions at the end of the presentation. So I'll give you a status update on the National Digital Trails Project. Nationwide Trails Network came about from this project, so it's important to recognize the project itself. I'll provide you an update of the Nationwide Digital Trails database. I will describe benefits of a robust nationwide digital trails database. And we'll also share some plans that we have for digital trails data aggregation process in the future. And finally, we should have some time for questions at the end. So before we jump into talking about the Nationwide Trails data set, I would like to step back and talk to you about the National Digital Trails Network project overall. As we all know, our nation is home to a vast network of recreational trails traveled by millions of citizens. The trails managed by numerous organizations and jurisdictions and do not form a coherent connected network often. So in 2018, the Department of Interior put out a vision to connect trail systems to expand recreational opportunities on the nation's public lands. In response to this vision, USGS was reached out to develop a project proposal to support this vision. USGS worked in conjunction with Esri to develop a prototype or a tool that would support this vision and look into other tools that we could be developing to support the vision. In 2018, in fall of 2018, USGS received the initial request from DOI to develop the tools. And they worked with Esri and they come out with a proposal, project proposal that went back to the Department of Interior Secretary along with a 2-year project plan. Everybody got thumbs up. They like what they've seen, and USGS received a 2-year funding for the project to start in December 2018. So our concept for achieving this vision is embodied in 3 main goals. First, we want to have a web-based decision support tool that will automatically identify possible routes for connecting existing trails. We wanted to make it web-based because we don't want users to have to be GIS experts, and anybody can just use a web-based tool as long as it's user-friendly. We wanted to target the main user group of land managers planning for building new trails. The tool that we have developed is called Trails, so it should be pretty easy to remember, and it stands for Trail Routing, Analysis, and Information Linkage System. The second goal of the project was to create a robust nationwide digital trails database. We need good digital trails data that shows existing trail systems. USGS, as part of its mission, has been aggregating trails data from authoritative sources for several years, but a much lower level of effort. As a result, we already had a starter set at the beginning of this project, but through this project, we really were able to accelerate the aggregation effort for additional trails data nationwide. Finally, the third goal for the project was to develop tools in conjunction with those agencies that manage trails to maintain the trails data. Our concept is to use a mobile application so that people in the field, whether they are National Park Service or BLM employees, or possible in some cases even the public, can provide updated information about trails. So for goal 1, for the Trails application, usually that will be a standalone presentation or workshop, and we usually provide those on requested basis. So I will not be covering Trails application in this presentation. Goal 3, the development of mobile maintenance portal, has been on hold over this last year. We've gathered project requirements, and we really hope to revisit this goal in the future. I will focus this presentation on goal 2, creating a robust nationwide digital trails database. Trails dataset is housed under the transportation group of the national map layers. As I mentioned earlier, USGS has already been aggregating trails data prior to this project. So in December of 2018, we had about 175,000 miles of trails to start with. And just over a year and a half, we are up to 253,000 miles of public domain trails data from federal, state, and local lands. From December 2018 to August 2020, you can see how much denser our map has gotten on the trails data. We've been aggregating data from authoritative data sources. This is some of the keywords to highlight. USGS aggregates data. We do not create trails data. We can only aggregate trails data from authoritative data sources, and the data has to be available in the public domain. Our primary focus when the project came about is to really enhance the trails data that we have from the federal agencies. As you can see, we have over 80% of trails from Forest Service, National Park Service, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, and BLM. A really good, robust data sets coming from those agencies. And to highlight our effort over this last year is we focused our attention also to state partnerships. And we moved from over 12,000 miles in 2018 when we first started to over 79,000 miles of trails coming from the state partners. Speaking of the state partners, right now we have trails data from 25 states, and we have 5 more states in review right now. So we'll have more trails, state trails getting added to the data set. For some states, you'll see trails network a little more dense than others, and this is the reason for how the data gets managed. So in some cases, we are getting data only for trails that are located within state lands, because that's the only trails data that the state land managers are managing. And if we want to get additional data in those states, we have to reach out to more local sources like counties or regional organizations. In other states, as you see an example in Florida, is a lot more dense. A single state agency actually manages a statewide data set, and that's the case when we're able to collect the more dense network of trails going into the data set from one source. Besides aggregating trails data over the last year and a half, we also focused on expanding the schema that can accommodate what kind of information we collect about the trails. USGS already had a certain schema defined for the trails data set, and we worked with a federal interagency group to help standardize the schema of the trails database, which is based on the FGVC Federal Trail Data Standard. So apart from collecting information for trail name, trail number, source originator, and information about the data source, which that's information we have been collecting already, we expanded the schema to accommodate such information as any alternate names, because we found there's a lot of data providers have those, and we need to be able to capture those. We also wanted to capture the information about the trails. So what kind of trail type is it? Because that makes a difference. Are they water trails, terra trails, or snow trails? And finally, we need to capture what are the appropriate uses designated on those trails. Are they appropriate for bicycles, dog sledding, hiking, pack and saddle, snowshoeing, motorized or non-motorized watercraft, cross-country skiing, four-wheel driving, motorcycles, snowmobiles. So all of those are now being able to capture in the USGS schema. We put a lot of effort into aggregating the data, and I would like to talk about why we're doing this. What are the benefits of having a nationwide data set, and why the users are really buying into it and are willing to partner with us to build a robust nationwide data set? The most straightforward answer, it supports GIS analysis. The goal one I mentioned, it was to build a trails application that allows land managers to identify possible connecting corridors for existing trail systems. That application is going to be successful only if we have a robust data set of existing trails that the users can use the tool to identify connectivity for. Similarly, somebody could download a nationwide data set on their own computer and combine the layers with other GIS layers and perform their own GIS analysis. And last but not least, we can't forget about mobile applications, mainly used for pulling in Trails data and services into the mobile applications. Trails, nationwide Trails dataset also provides us a clear picture of the trails next door. What we found in a lot of cases when data is managed by a single source, they often have trails only within their jurisdictional boundaries. And if they need to perform any sort of analysis or develop partnerships outside of their boundaries, they often have to tap into researching data from other data providers around their outside of the jurisdictional boundaries. So that could be pretty time consuming and not very efficient. Having a nationwide data set allows a user to download the data or access the data and get a big picture view of all the trails around their jurisdictional boundaries as well as within their boundaries in one place. I already mentioned the effort that we're putting into standardizing the schema and expanding the schema for USGS data set. The reason we wanted to do that is so we can accommodate information coming from the data sources. As you've seen, we have over 30 sources of data coming to the national data set at this point, and we're looking to expand those even more and continue to grow the data set. Every single one of those data sources has something unique in their schema, and they often don't match with each other. So you're collecting your apples and cherries and pears and whatever other fruit you can, and you throwing them all in one basket. So putting them all into the standard data schema allows every source data to talk to each other. And the benefit of that is when the user wants to query data or access data, they're looking at the same schema for all of those data sets, and they can just do one query for their area of interest to perform analysis. Finally, having one standalone nationwide data set in the public domain allows users to access the data free for whatever needs they have. And USGS actually offers several ways of accessing this information. And I'm going to cover 6 ways to view and access the nationwide Trails data set. The first and most logical place to go is the National Digital Trails Project page. We have links to how somebody can acquire the Trails data associated, since it's associated with this project. Another place is called Trails Explorer. It's a viewer application that overlays the most up-to-date Trails data set over the PAD-US data layers and TopoMap. So for those of you that would like to see Trails data displayed on top of jurisdictional, PAD-US is the protected area database. So those are jurisdictional boundaries. This application gives you very quick access to view the Trails data on top of jurisdictional boundaries and a TopoMap. Another place to go is a National Map Viewer. This is a viewer where users can go and view any of the national map layers, including water, elevation, transportation, structures, land cover, and others. As I mentioned earlier, to find the Trails feature, you have to actually expand your transportation data set first in the viewer, and then allocate the Trails feature set underneath it. To download the data set, you go to the National Map Data Download site. You can query data by a keyword or by a map view. Again, you would have to make sure you go to check off the transportation data set first and download data associated with that. And within the transportation database, you will be able to find the Trails feature set. For those of you that like to work with service endpoints, you can go to National Map Data Services, and if you expand the theme overlays data set for NHD, names, elevation, or transportation, you'll be able to find a service endpoint for the Trails data set in there, or you can also click on the web feature services, and that's another place to locate the service endpoint. Last but not least, for those of you that just want to grab a snapshot of a data set directly from the stage product directory, and you want to do it by a state boundary or nationwide, we offer those as well. Those typically get refreshed on different schedules depending what are you looking at, state or nationwide snapshot. You go to stage product directory, you locate your area of interest, and again, you go to transportation data set, and you'll be able to find either a shapefile download or geodatabase download for the trails feature class. One thing to highlight here is always pay attention to the last modified date. That's what's going to tell you when that snapshot was last updated, and I'll give you an idea what you should expect to see in there. So I covered all the benefits of the nationwide trails data set and the progress we have made. Now I would like to talk about the process, what it has taken us to get here, to get all these trails in. And it's been a lot of manual labor, a lot of data tracking, a lot of research, and a lot of coordination. So the first step, especially over this last year, I would emphasize on state partnerships. We developed a detailed outreach plan that covered every state and territory. So then we researched every state and territory and to find out which data sets they have available and what the appropriate points of contact are. As we located that information, we tracked that information in a different spreadsheet that recorded the point of contact, the date we discussed this information with them, what data they have available, how often it gets refreshed. If we got data from there, what kind of format? Is it a file geodatabase? Is it a service endpoint? So anything we need to know about this data set before we can actually aggregate it. And if we ever need to refresh it, where do we go back to find this information? Next step, after we get the data from a certain source, we assess that data set for minimal requirements and populate the assessment form. And that's done by another team of folks that do data integration. They check for spatial accuracy, they check for trail names, make sure those are present. They check which jurisdictional boundaries the data intersects. They check for arrows, such as dupes, overshoots, undershoots, and they check if lines are correctly portrayed. They usually grab a sample of a data set and they do all those checks. They fill out an assessment form that communicates whether the data has passed the minimal requirements. And if it does, then the data moves into the next step of aggregation process. And if it doesn't, we send that assessment form to the data provider and communicate with them why we cannot aggregate their data today and what improvements need to be made. If the data has been past the minimal requirements, the next step is to convert the schema. As I mentioned, a lot of those data sets coming with a different schema. So it's a very important step to make sure we match the schema from a data source to use JS schema in the correct way. Sometimes this step requires some follow-up with the data source providers to clarify some questions. And once we have the schema matched, then the data is ready to be integrated into the nationwide data set. As our integration team is working on integrating the data, sometimes they may catch some issues with the data. And we like to capture those issues and communicate those back to the data providers. The reason for that is if the data providers can address those issues in their own data sets, next time we get this data for refresh, that's going to be less work for UseJS and the end users will get a better product. So as you can see, the current process that we've had over this last year is heavily manual. We have a lot of teams communicating to each other with spreadsheets and emails, and all the communication with the partners is done also typically through emails or calls. And so a lot of manual tracking of information and steps. So we have a lot of space for improvement. As I mentioned, we have 30 data sources already and more coming in. So we really started to think long-term. What can we do to improve the current process and make it more efficient? Right now, we're doing manual tracking and communication processes. We can do our data aggregation at a limited pace because of that. It takes a lot of time to research, do outreach, record information, pass it on to another person. So there's definitely, if we can do this in an more efficient pace, we can be getting more data coming into us. We can be tracking data. We've been tracking data integration progress manually, and we're not really able to report minor milestones back to the data source providers. We can tell them where they didn't pass minimum requirements, and we can also tell them when the data has been integrated. But we can't really tell them your data is in this step of the progress right now because it's just too much to track and report back. And finally, when UseJS captures those errors during the integration process, right now we're saving them in shapefiles, and we would like to be able to communicate information back to the data providers efficiently so they can be capturing the information on their end timely as well. So with that in mind and looking into the future of growing the data set, we came up with a plan for developing Trails data portal. We hope that this Trails data portal will streamline data submission and communication with the data providers. We're envisioning a website where authoritative data provider can log in. They would populate their POC information, the point of contact information themselves. They would also provide schema mapping and metadata for the data set because they are the data experts of their data. We want them to tell us how to match the data to UseJS schema. They were able to submit the data for UseJS review. They will also get automated submission status updates. So if the data moves into the next step of the progress, they will get updates associated with that step of the progress. They would get notified and view any comments that may be coming from UseJS. The UseJS is reviewing the data and integrating the data. And finally, they would get the final notification when a data set has made it into a nationwide data set, and they can expect to see that data if they were do a download, access the service endpoint. Similarly, UseJS staff can use the National Digital Trails portal for making their workflow more efficient as well. They can be notified when the data is coming in automatically. They can be populating the assessment form for the preliminary review results in the form itself right into the portal for the data providers POC to review. They can update the submission status as they move a submission through the process. They can download the provider data and metadata, and they can also access POC information as needed, especially when we run into any of the specific questions. We're hoping to develop the Trails data portal over the next fiscal year. Hopefully no roadblocks coming our way. We hope that this will give us that semi-automated batch uploading of digital Trails data. It will streamline UseJS internal workflow. It will help us to improve our data quality reviews and providing feedback to data providers. And as an added bonus, it will give us a dashboard for data visualization, reports, and data download. Long term, and it's a long stretch, but we really hope that this portal could take us to a nationwide digital Trails data set as a truly collaborative effort where the authoritative data sources could be in charge of the data that goes into the nationwide digital Trails data set. So with all the information in hand, some of you may be wondering how can you be helping with a project like this. For those of you that have authoritative Trails data and you don't see it in a national data set, we probably have not reached out to you yet. Especially we'll be shifting to the local, regional groups over the next year, and we would love to hear from you. For some of you that are authoritative data providers, then you may want to partner to pilot the Trails data portal once it's available, probably towards the end of the second part of the next fiscal year. We would love to have a couple of partners to pilot the portal and get further feedback how we can make it useful for the data providers. We also need to get the word out. The Trails application and this project overall is only successful if we have a good user community using them. And last but not least, I mentioned that this was a 2-year, started out of a 2-year project. We are funded through the end of this fiscal year, and we're looking at funding opportunities to continue this project past FY21. So we are trying to identify options and priorities for future project funding. Now we can take questions, and if any of you think of questions after this presentation, you can always email us questions and comments to trails@usejs.gov.